It was a late afternoon in a small diner where the air was thick with the quiet hum of conversations and the soft clinking of silverware against plates. In the far corner, Samuel Harris, a 75-year-old veteran, sat in silence, his fingers resting against the worn wooden table. His coffee had long gone cold, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the entrance, waiting patiently for his son. The door swung open with force. Two police officers, Mitchell and Reynolds, stepped in, their presence commanding immediate attention. They weren't looking for an empty table. Their eyes scanned the room, and within seconds, they landed on Samuel. Mitchell leaned slightly toward Reynolds and muttered something under his breath. A smirk formed on both their faces. To them, Samuel didn't belong here. An old black man sitting alone in a middle-class diner was an anomaly, an inconvenience. Mitchell strode over and stopped beside Samuel's table. His voice was sharp, devoid of any politeness. "Hey, old man, what are you doing here?" It wasn't a greeting, it was an interrogation. Samuel looked up slowly, his eyes calm and unwavering. "I'm waiting for my son." Reynolds scoffed. "A man like you has a son? What? Waiting for a welfare check?" A few soft chuckles echoed through the diner, but most people looked away, avoiding the scene. They had seen situations like this before. They knew better than to intervene. Speaking up meant risking becoming the next target. Mitchell folded his arms. "Show me your ID. We need to check it." This wasn't a request, it was an order. Samuel let out a slow breath, reaching into his coat pocket. His fingers brushed against the edges of his worn leather wallet before pulling out an old veteran's ID card. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Mitchell without a word. Mitchell barely glanced at it before letting out a dry laugh. "This has to be fake." Reynolds chuckled. "Guys like you are only good for washing dishes or hauling crates in the military. You expect us to believe you actually fought." Mitchell tossed the ID card back onto the table carelessly, then knocked Samuel's veteran cap off his head, sending it tumbling to the floor. A few patrons turned away, unwilling to witness what was happening. Samuel didn't react. He didn't need to. His silence, his steady gaze, those alone were enough to unnerve men like Mitchell. Mitchell took another step forward, his hand brushing against his belt where his handcuffs gleamed under the dim lights. "I'll say it one last time. You have two choices. Get up and walk out now, or we'll escort you out." Samuel remained still, but this time his gaze dropped slightly, shifting toward the table. Mitchell followed his eyes. There, beside the veteran's ID, was a reserved table card. The bold letters printed across it read, "Reserved, Police Chief Daniel Harris." Mitchell froze. His expression changed in an instant, and his hand instinctively moved away from his belt. Reynolds, standing beside him, stiffened as well. The diner fell into complete silence. The weight of the moment pressed down on every single person in the room. This wasn't just about a disrupted meal. It was a reminder that injustice still thrived in the smallest, most ordinary moments, and sometimes all it took was a single revelation to turn everything on its head. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you are watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more. Samuel Harris, 75 years old, was once a soldier who had served in the United States military. He had stood on brutal battlefields, fighting for a country he believed would honor those who sacrificed for it. He had faced death, lost brothers in arms, and survived the most harrowing moments of war. But when he returned home, the glory of being a soldier was not enough to shield him from discrimination. His medals could not erase the condescending stares, the sharp words, or the prejudices that followed him wherever he went. He had given his youth to his country, yet he was still treated as an outsider in the land he had fought to defend. Today, Samuel was not a soldier on the battlefield. He was just a father sitting in a small diner, waiting for his son to join him for dinner, a simple, ordinary moment. But he had no idea that within minutes, injustice would find him once again, right in the very place where he should have felt safe. The diner door swung open with force, the small bell above it ringing sharply, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the late afternoon. The heavy footsteps of two police officers, Mitchell and Reynolds, echoed against the tiled floor as they strode in with an air of authority. The room seemed to tense for a brief moment. A few diners glanced up, their eyes flicking over the two uniformed men before quickly looking away, focusing on their meals. No one wanted to draw attention to themselves. The locals knew all too well how Mitchell and Reynolds operated. Men who carried themselves as if they were the ultimate power in town, always looking for an opportunity to assert their dominance, especially over those they believed didn't belong. Mitchell, tall and broad-shouldered with a smirk that rarely left his face, flicked his chin toward the bar, surveying the room as if evaluating each person inside. Reynolds, slightly shorter but with sharp, calculating eyes, crossed his arms and scanned the space as though searching for something or someone. Then their eyes locked onto him. In the corner by the window, Samuel Harris sat in quiet solitude, an elderly black man. His worn-out coat was draped over his shoulders, a faded cap on his head with the words Vietnam Veteran barely legible after years of wear. He spoke to no one, his calloused hands folded loosely on the wooden table, his gaze lost in the world beyond the window, deep in thought. But to Mitchell and Reynolds, his mere presence here was already a problem. Mitchell tilted his head slightly, his smirk widening into something more sinister. Without speaking, he nudged Reynolds with his elbow. Reynolds let out a quiet scoff, flashing a knowing grin. They didn't need words to communicate. A man like Samuel didn't belong here. Without hesitation, they changed direction, striding straight toward his table. No one in the diner spoke, but a few cast uneasy glances in their direction, a mix of discomfort and apprehension in their expressions. They knew Mitchell and Reynolds. They knew Samuel Harris. And they knew one thing for certain. This confrontation would not end easily. Mitchell stood at the edge of the table, leaning in slightly. His cold gaze swept over Samuel as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded trash. He tilted his head, his voice laced with mockery, devoid of even the slightest hint of respect. "What the hell are you doing here?" It wasn't a question, it wasn't curiosity. It was an interrogation, a thinly veiled command. Samuel slowly lifted his gaze, meeting Mitchell's eyes with calm steadiness. He showed no fear, no defiance, only a quiet resilience. He had seen that look before. He had heard that tone before. But that didn't mean he had to accept it. "I'm waiting for my son." His response was simple, direct. There was no apology in his tone, no justification. Reynolds let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He shook his head, his eyes scanning Samuel from head to toe as if the very idea was absurd. He folded his arms, glancing at Mitchell before smirking, his voice louder now, deliberately drawing the attention of the entire diner. "A black old man like you has a son? What for? To collect welfare checks?" Reynolds burst out laughing, the sound dripping with cruelty and contempt. Mitchell chuckled along as if the remark was the funniest thing he had heard all day. The air in the diner shifted. The once lively conversations faded into an uncomfortable silence. Some customers pretended not to hear, keeping their heads down, focused on their meals. Others stole quick glances at Samuel, fleeting looks of pity before turning away. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to become the next target. Samuel didn't react immediately. His hands resting on the table curled slightly, not out of fear, not out of anger, but because these words were all too familiar. He had heard them before. He had endured them his entire life. But no matter how many times he had heard them, they still carried weight. Mitchell planted a hand on the table, leaning in closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel more personal, more cutting. "Be honest, old man. What are you really doing here? This isn't a place for someone like you." Reynolds took a step back, arms still crossed, watching intently. He was waiting for a reaction, hoping for one, waiting for Samuel to slip, to lash out, to give them the excuse they were looking for. Samuel took a slow, steady breath. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached for his coffee, lifting the cup with deliberate ease, taking a small sip. Mitchell raised an eyebrow, displeased. He had expected resistance, expected submission, anything but this composed silence. Reynolds scoffed, his arms tightening against his chest, his expression darkening. No one in the diner spoke. No one interfered. They simply watched, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Mitchell straightened, crossing his arms over his chest, his gaze sharp and predatory, locking on to Samuel like a hunter who had just cornered his prey. He lifted his chin slightly, his voice devoid of patience. "Hand over your ID." It wasn't a request, it wasn't a question. It was an order. Samuel met Mitchell's eyes without a flicker of fear, without a hint of hesitation. He had heard this tone before countless times throughout his life from men who thought authority gave them the right to control others. He knew that refusing would only escalate the situation. With steady hands, he reached into the pocket of his worn-out coat, pulled out an old leather wallet, and carefully retrieved a veteran's ID card. Without a word, he placed it neatly on the table and slid it forward. Mitchell glanced down but didn't pick it up right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his mouth curling into a smirk of pure contempt. "This looks fake." There was no real doubt in his voice. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Reynolds let out a short laugh, stepping closer. He gave the ID card a dismissive glance, lifting it carelessly between two fingers, turning it over as if it were a scrap of paper. "Back in the day, guys like you were only good for washing dishes in the military. Who the hell would believe you actually fought?" He let the card drop back onto the table as if it held no more value than a discarded receipt. Samuel remained composed, his expression unchanged. But deep within his eyes, there was something else. Not anger, not fear, just exhaustion. Not from the insults, he had heard them all before, but from the sheer predictability of it. The way history kept repeating itself generation after generation without ever changing. Mitchell planted a hand on the table and leaned in closer, his voice lowering to something darker, more threatening. "You expect me to believe this? Someone like you, a veteran? What? Did they have you mopping floors at a base somewhere?" Reynolds let out a louder laugh, nodding as if he found the whole thing amusing. "If that's the case, maybe the U.S. military wasn't as tough as I thought." Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply held Mitchell's gaze, silent and unwavering. And that silence, that unshaken presence, only made Mitchell more agitated. His jaw tightened, frustration creeping into his expression. With a sharp motion, he reached for his belt, pulling out a pair of handcuffs and slamming them onto the table. The loud clank made several diners flinch in their seats. "All right, old man. If you've got nothing to hide, then stand up. I think we need to take a closer look." Reynolds grinned, folding his arms, his eyes lighting up with anticipation. "Yeah, who knows? Maybe he's got something in his pocket. A knife? Maybe some contraband." Mitchell picked up the veteran's ID once more, this time flipping it between his fingers before tossing it back onto the table with deliberate force, as if emphasizing its worthlessness. His expression hardened, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "Stand up." This was no longer a suggestion. It was a warning, a signal that if Samuel didn't comply, they would make sure he regretted it. Samuel remained seated, his expression unshaken, his body still. The lack of reaction only seemed to infuriate Mitchell and Reynolds further. A man like Samuel, they thought, should be cowering, pleading, trembling under their authority. But he wasn't. He just sat there, calm, as if this moment was nothing new to him. And that, more than anything, made their blood boil. Mitchell's smirk curled into something more menacing. Without warning, he reached for the coffee cup in front of Samuel and tilted it over, spilling its contents straight onto his chest. The warm liquid seeped into Samuel's worn coat, darkening the fabric with a large, spreading stain. A few diners gasped softly. A couple of them looked up, momentarily stunned. But no one spoke. No one intervened. Reynolds let out a mocking chuckle, folding his arms. "Oh, my bad, old man. Guess my hand slipped." Samuel didn't flinch. He didn't gasp, didn't wipe at his coat. He simply lowered his eyes for a moment, observing the stain, then lifted them again, meeting Mitchell's gaze with something that wasn't fear, wasn't anger, just quiet understanding, as if Mitchell had just confirmed everything Samuel already knew about him. That silence made Mitchell angrier than any outburst would have. His sneer deepened as he reached down, snatched the veteran's cap off Samuel's head, and tossed it onto the floor with deliberate malice. He pressed his boot down onto it, grinding the heel into the faded fabric. "This doesn't belong to a useless old man like you. You're not worthy of it." Reynolds burst into laughter, nudging the cap aside with his foot as if it were trash. A murmur rippled through the diner. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some clenched their utensils a little tighter. A few exchanged uncertain glances. But no one stood up. No one said a word. Mitchell wasn't finished. His eyes flicked to the side of the table where Samuel's old wooden cane leaned against the chair. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Reaching down, he grabbed the cane, lifting it up and examining it as if it were a cheap toy. "This is what keeps you limping around, huh?" Samuel's hands curled slightly, but he still didn't speak. Reynolds smirked. "Hey, Mitchell, looks like the old man really likes that thing. But I don't think he needs it anymore." Mitchell's grin widened. Then, with one swift motion, he snapped the cane in half. The sharp crack echoed through the diner. The broken pieces fell to the floor, one landing near Samuel's feet. A few diners let out quiet gasps. A couple of them visibly flinched. But no one moved. No one stepped forward. Mitchell let the remaining piece drop to the floor like discarded trash. Yeah, old man, you won't be needing that anymore, because you're about to be escorted out of here. Reynolds nodded, reaching for his belt, pulling out the handcuffs with a smirk. Time to take you for a little walk. Mitchell still had a smirk on his face, his hand having just tossed the broken pieces of the cane to the floor. But then his eyes stopped moving. He didn't immediately understand what had caught his attention, but for the first time in the last few minutes, a sudden chill ran down his spine. Reynolds, still crossing his arms and laughing, quickly sensed the shift. He tilted his head, frowning as he noticed his partner suddenly frozen in place, eyes locked onto the surface of the table. Mitchell wasn't smirking anymore. His gaze slowly moved from the veteran's cap on the floor to the small, unassuming white card lying in the center of the table. A reserved table card, crisp and bold, with clear black lettering that left no room for misinterpretation. Reserved, Police Chief Daniel Harris. His heart seemed to skip a beat. Reynolds saw it now too. He blinked, then blinked again, as if trying to process what he was looking at. Neither of them spoke. A cold wave crept up their spines. They didn't need to exchange words to realize they were in deep trouble. Mitchell swallowed dryly, his eyes darting around the diner, seeking reassurance. But instead, he found something else, the silent, knowing glances of the patrons. The people who had been quiet all this time were not afraid of Mitchell and Reynolds. They had been waiting for this moment. He clenched his fist, his mind racing. No way, he muttered under his breath. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a joke. Reynolds, visibly unnerved now, looked from the card to Samuel, then back at the name printed on the table. It's probably not the same guy, he whispered, but the confidence in his voice had vanished. Mitchell shook his head, trying to steady himself. No way. No damn way. But as he struggled to convince himself that this was just an unfortunate coincidence, the diner door swung open again. The sharp sound of polished boots hitting the tiled floor filled the room. A tall figure stepped inside. Mitchell and Reynolds barely had time to react before the realization crashed over them. The man who had just entered was none other than Police Chief Daniel Harris. The atmosphere in the diner shifted in an instant. The hushed murmurs evaporated. The patrons who had been feigning indifference now sat fully engaged. No one wanted to miss what was about to happen. Daniel Harris moved with an air of controlled power, his presence alone demanding respect. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He had already seen enough. His sharp eyes swept the room before locking onto the table where his father sat. Samuel remained still, his clothes stained with spilled coffee, his broken cane lying on the floor, his veteran cap discarded nearby. Mitchell and Reynolds stood frozen, their faces drained of color. They didn't need anyone to spell it out for them. They knew they had just made a mistake they could never take back. The diner door swung open once more. This time, it wasn't just another customer or a passerby. It was Daniel Harris, a tall, commanding figure with an air of authority that came naturally to men used to leading and enforcing order. No one in the diner needed to ask who he was. The sharpness in his gaze, the deliberate, measured way he walked, the sheer presence he carried, it was enough to make it clear this was a man who didn't just demand respect, he embodied it. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly. The hushed whispers died down. The people who had been pretending not to notice the scene unfolding now sat motionless, unwilling to blink, afraid they might miss what was about to happen. They knew this moment would change everything. Daniel Harris entered and immediately spotted his father. Samuel sat upright, his face calm, composed, as if nothing had happened. Yet his stained clothes, the overturned veteran's cap on the floor, and the snapped cane beside him told a different story. Daniel didn't need an explanation. One glance was enough. Mitchell and Reynolds stood frozen, their bodies rigid as though gravity itself had tightened its grip on them. A weight settled in their stomachs as the horrifying realization set in. They had made a grave mistake. The smug arrogance, the mocking laughter, the cruel taunts they had flung so carelessly just moments ago, every word now hung in the air like a curse they couldn't take back. A cold shiver crawled up their spines as Daniel's eyes flickered over every single detail of the scene in front of him. He didn't need an explanation. He didn't need to ask questions. He had seen enough. No one in the diner dared to move. A few swallowed hard. Others instinctively shifted in their seats, as if wanting to distance themselves from the epicenter of the storm that was about to erupt. Mitchell inhaled sharply, trying to steady himself, but his throat felt tight, constricted. Reynolds blinked rapidly, his fingers clenching and unclenching as if searching for a way out, a solution, an escape. But there was none. Daniel Harris said nothing, yet the weight of his silence was more damning than any reprimand or outburst could ever be. His eyes carried something far heavier than anger, disappointment, not just in the two officers standing before him, but in the very system he had once believed in, a system his father had fought to protect, had given his youth to serve, only to be repaid with humiliation and disrespect. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of something far more dangerous, inevitable consequences. Mitchell and Reynolds didn't need to be told what was happening. They knew. And they also knew what was coming next. The entire diner was engulfed in an unsettling silence. No more clinking of silverware against plates. No more hushed conversations. Even those who had previously lowered their heads to avoid looking could no longer pretend. At this moment, no one could tear their eyes away from what was unfolding before them. No one dared to move. No one dared to breathe too loudly. They all knew they were witnessing a moment that none of them would ever forget. Daniel Harris remained where he stood, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. The weight of his silence was suffocating, pressing down on every person present. No one knew what would happen next, but they all understood that this was no longer just about two officers and an elderly man. This was an irreversible mistake, a moment that could never be undone. Mitchell swallowed hard, his throat suddenly parched. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead, even though the temperature in the diner hadn't changed. He inhaled sharply, trying to speak, but the words that left his lips lacked the arrogance and defiance he had displayed just minutes earlier. His voice came out hoarse, a slight tremble betraying his attempts to control it. "Sir, this was just a misunderstanding." Reynolds quickly nodded, his voice stumbling over itself, stripped of all the confidence he had when he had humiliated Samuel moments ago. We didn't know. If we had known, if we had realized he was your father, Daniel didn't react immediately. He didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't move, didn't change his expression. And that was what made it even more terrifying. The absence of an immediate outburst made the tension unbearable. It trapped Mitchell and Reynolds in a suffocating atmosphere where any word they spoke now would only make things worse. Every eye in the diner remained fixed on Daniel, waiting. Not because they expected him to explode in anger, but because they knew that the fury of a man like him didn't need to be expressed through shouting. It was there in his eyes, in his steady breath, in the heavy silence stretching on, making it clear that every second without a response was a punishment in itself. Mitchell swallowed again, desperately searching for an excuse, a way to justify their actions. But there was nothing to say. No explanation could erase what they had done. No justification could take away the humiliation Samuel had just endured. The silence dragged on, and with every passing second, Mitchell and Reynolds felt as if the ground beneath them was crumbling. There was no escape. They had already sunk too deep, and now all they could do was wait for their sentence to be delivered. Daniel Harris remained standing motionless, his face unreadable, yet the atmosphere inside the diner had completely changed. He didn't need to raise his voice or show any outward signs of anger because the sheer weight of his silence was enough to push Mitchell and Reynolds into the depths of panic. The other diners stayed frozen, unwilling to make a sound. Some pretended to continue eating, but it was clear that no one could take their eyes off the scene in front of them. They all knew they were witnessing a moment they would never forget. Daniel's gaze slowly moved across the room. He didn't look at the two officers immediately. Instead, his eyes scanned every small detail of the scene before him. His gaze rested on his father, Samuel Harris, the honorable man who had once dedicated his youth to this country, now sitting quietly with coffee stains on his shirt, his veteran's cap trampled on the floor, and his cane snapped in half like a cruel declaration of power. No words were needed. He had seen enough. He took a deep breath, then slowly turned, his cold stare finally landing on Mitchell and Reynolds. Just moments ago, these two men had been arrogant, laughing, mocking, and humiliating an elderly man. But now they stood pale-faced, stiff as statues, their limbs locked in place as if paralyzed. Daniel held their gaze for several seconds, saying nothing, letting the tension rise to its peak. He wanted them to feel every passing second, to let the crushing weight of this moment settle deep in their bones, to know that there was no way to escape the consequences of what they had done. Finally, when the pressure had reached its breaking point, Daniel spoke. His voice was slow, measured, deep, yet carried an undeniable power. What exactly did you just do to my father? Just one question. No shouting, no rage. But that single sentence alone was enough to make Mitchell and Reynolds feel as if the ground beneath them had crumbled. Mitchell swallowed hard, struggling to control his breathing, but it felt as though his lungs weren't getting enough air. He turned to Reynolds, hoping his partner would speak first, but when he looked over, he saw that Reynolds was just as frozen, his forehead glistening with sweat, his eyes wide with panic. Unable to drag out the silence any longer, Mitchell took a deep breath, attempting to regain his composure. But when he spoke, his voice betrayed him, shaking with embarrassment. Sir, this was just a misunderstanding. Reynolds quickly nodded, rushing to salvage the situation, but his voice fared no better than Mitchell's. We didn't know. If we had known, if we had realized he was your father, Daniel cut him off immediately. So, if he wasn't my father, you still would have done that. The question sliced through the air like a blade, severing any pathetic excuses they might have come up with. Mitchell and Reynolds were completely silent. There was no way to answer without condemning themselves. If they said no, they would be admitting to discrimination, using their authority to oppress a man simply because of his race and age. If they said yes, it would mean they were willing to do this to anyone at any time. There was no way out. Daniel stared at them, but there was no anger in his eyes, only deep, crushing disappointment. Mitchell and Reynolds could have handled anger. They could have withstood threats. But standing before the sheer disappointment of the most powerful man in their department was unbearable. Mitchell tried to open his mouth again, but this time no words came out. Daniel didn't break eye contact, as if measuring the worth of the two men before him, deciding whether they deserved to remain in his ranks. The silence stretched on, and with every passing second, Mitchell and Reynolds felt as if the ground beneath them was collapsing. There was no escape. They had already gone too far, and now all they could do was wait for their sentence to be delivered. The diner remained trapped in suffocating silence. No one dared to move. No one spoke. All eyes were fixed on Daniel Harris, waiting for his verdict. Mitchell and Reynolds stood frozen, cold sweat trailing down their spines, their fists clenched out of instinct. They no longer dared to meet the gaze of anyone around them because they knew they had no power here anymore. Daniel stared at the two officers, not needing even a second to decide. He had made his decision the moment he saw his father sitting there, humiliated and disrespected. There was no need for further investigation, no need for witnesses. His voice cut through the heavy air, deep and sharp like a blade. You are both suspended immediately. The word struck the diner like a hammer blow. A few patrons instinctively held their breath. Some exchanged quick glances, but no one was surprised. This punishment was inevitable. Mitchell blinked rapidly, as if trying to wake himself from a nightmare. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. He had made a mistake, but being suspended on the spot? It was too much. Sir, Mitchell tried to speak, his voice weaker, stripped of its usual arrogance. We didn't know he was your father. Daniel didn't blink, didn't flinch, but there was an undeniable sharpness in his eyes. That doesn't matter. His voice was firm, leaving no room for excuses. Everyone deserves respect. The words hit Mitchell like a punch to the gut. There was nothing he could say, no way to argue, because it was too true, too obvious, so undeniable that all of his excuses crumbled in an instant. Reynolds swallowed hard, desperately searching for a way out. His eyes darted around the diner, hoping for someone, anyone, to stand up for them, to say that things weren't as bad as they seemed, that this was all just a misunderstanding. But no one spoke, not a single person, because every single one of them had seen exactly what happened. Mitchell turned back to Daniel, making one last attempt to salvage himself. His voice came out smaller than ever, barely above a whisper. We just thought he didn't belong here. Daniel's expression darkened instantly as he snapped his attention back to them, his voice harder than steel. And who gave you the right to decide who belongs where? The question fell like the final strike of a gavel. Mitchell was left paralyzed. Reynolds dropped his gaze, his face drained of color. They knew, at this moment, it was over. Daniel turned to another officer who had entered the diner, a subordinate uninvolved in the situation. Strip them of their badges. They will surrender their weapons and leave the force immediately. Silence once again filled the room, but this time it was no longer tense. It was the silence of justice being restored. Mitchell and Reynolds, once so confident, so certain they could act without consequence, now stood as nothing more than broken men, stripped of everything they had once used to assert power over others. They were no longer police officers. They were just two men who had destroyed their own careers with their arrogance and cruelty. Mitchell's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The badge that had once given him authority now felt like dead weight on his chest, and as he slowly reached up to unclasp it, his hands trembled. The cold metal felt foreign in his fingers, as if it no longer belonged to him. Reynolds stood next to him, motionless, his mind racing, his pulse pounding against his skull. He had seen people stripped of their rank before, but never had he imagined it would happen to him. Not like this. Not in front of an entire room of witnesses who now looked at him with something worse than anger, disgust. The officer Daniel had called over stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he extended a hand. "Your badge," he said, his voice steady but final. Mitchell hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. His mind screamed for him to fight back, to argue, to plead for another chance. But deep down, he knew there was no way out. His fingers curled around the badge pinned to his chest, and with a final tug, he pulled it free. The clink of metal against the table as he set it down sounded louder than it should have. It was the sound of an ending. Reynolds followed, his movements mechanical, his face blank though his mind was screaming. He had spent years on the force, built his entire identity around that badge, and now it was gone, just like that. The gun on his hip suddenly felt heavier, like a reminder of what he no longer deserved to carry. Without waiting to be asked, he unclipped it from his belt and set it down beside the badge. Daniel didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The weight of what had just happened was enough. The other officer took the badges and weapons, giving both men one final look before stepping back. "You're done," he said simply. "Get out." Mitchell clenched his jaw, his face burning with humiliation as he turned toward the exit, knowing that every eye in the diner was still on him. Reynolds hesitated for just a second longer before following, his steps heavy, dragging. They had walked into this diner with their heads high, convinced they were untouchable, and now they left as nothing. No title, no authority, no respect. Just two disgraced men who had let their arrogance cost them everything. The door swung shut behind them, and the silence remained. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shift began. People turned to look at Samuel Harris, the man who had sat through it all with the same quiet dignity he had always carried, the same man who had endured their cruelty without a word. Yet in the end, it was his presence, his mere existence, that had undone them. And Daniel, standing beside him, exhaled slowly. Justice had been served, but the weight in his chest remained. He looked at his father, at the broken cane on the floor, at the spilled coffee on his clothes, and he knew this moment was only the beginning. Mitchell and Reynolds stood motionless, as if they had just taken a blow straight to the chest. They couldn't believe what had just happened. Only minutes ago, they had been powerful officers, commanding respect, humiliating an elderly man without consequence. Now, everything had collapsed. Everything they had taken for granted, their authority, their position, their sense of control, had been stripped away in front of an entire room of witnesses. Mitchell clenched his fists, but not out of anger. The shame was eating him alive, gnawing at every part of his body. Reynolds was no better. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to look at anyone, because if he did, he would have to face the reality that every single person in that diner had just watched him fall. A fellow officer stepped forward without hesitation, removed their badges, and took their weapons from their belts. The weight of what was happening hit them harder than they could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about losing their jobs. It was about the humiliation of being stripped of what had once made them untouchable, right in front of those they had mistreated. The badges that had once given them power now felt like a reminder of everything they had lost. Mitchell swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight, as if he had swallowed burning coal. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to ask for another chance. But he knew there was nothing he could say that would undo what had just happened. No words could turn back time. It was too late. He felt a wave of frustration, but it wasn't directed at anyone but himself. He had been blind, arrogant, too convinced of his own superiority to see that he had crossed a line that could never be undone. Reynolds took a step back, then another, as if trying to escape. But it didn't matter where he went. No matter how far he ran, he couldn't outrun the truth. He had destroyed his own life in the span of a single evening. The silence in the diner was suffocating. No one spoke up for them. No one defended them. No one felt sorry for them. They had spent years making people bow before them, but now they were the ones with their heads lowered in disgrace. Mitchell took a deep breath, trying to salvage whatever pride he had left, but his footsteps were slow, heavy, as if he was dragging the weight of his shame along with him. Reynolds followed behind, neither of them speaking, neither of them daring to look at each other. They left the diner with their backs hunched, no longer men of power, but broken figures retreating into the shadows. The door swung shut behind them, sealing their fate. The diner remained silent, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. No one touched their food. No one spoke. No one wanted to break the stillness of the moment because they all understood that they had just witnessed something important. A moment where justice had been served without violence, without shouting, without chaos, but with undeniable, inescapable truth. Samuel Harris sat unmoved, his back straight, his expression calm as he watched them leave. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile in triumph. He didn't look satisfied, because to him, this had never been about winning. He had seen too much injustice in his lifetime to believe that a single moment could erase the years of struggle. But at least tonight, they had been forced to face the consequences of their actions. Daniel Harris, the man who had just decided the fate of 2 officers with a single command, said nothing. He simply pulled out a chair and sat across from his father, as if this were just another evening, another dinner between the two of them. But everyone in the diner knew the truth. This was a moment that would never be forgotten. Mitchell stomped along the sidewalk, his footsteps heavy, his breath sharp, his chest tight with rage that burned hotter with every passing second. His mind replayed everything that had just happened in the diner. The way Daniel Harris had stripped him of his badge, his authority, his entire career in front of a room full of people. The humiliation was unbearable. The way those customers had looked at him when he had been disgraced, the calm, infuriating expression on Samuel Harris's face, as if he had expected it all along. The sickening realization that what should have been a simple display of dominance had turned into the complete and utter destruction of everything Mitchell had built. His fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms, but he barely noticed. He had never felt humiliation like this before, never felt so exposed, so powerless. Reynolds walked beside him in silence, his head down, his posture defeated. But Mitchell wasn't broken. Mitchell was burning. Every second that passed only fueled the fire inside him, a fire that demanded action, demanded justice, demanded vengeance. He had only been doing his job. Samuel Harris didn't belong in a place like that, and Mitchell had simply done what any other officer would have done to maintain order. But instead of being recognized for upholding the rules, the whole thing had turned into a self-righteous spectacle, a public display of so-called justice where Daniel Harris had been crowned the hero and Mitchell had been cast as the villain. His breathing quickened, his steps grew heavier, and with every step, his rage became more than just an emotion. It became a plan. He couldn't let this go. He wouldn't allow his career to be torn apart by a washed-up old man and a police chief looking to prove a point. He had been the one in control. He had been the one with power. And now, because of a single moment, he had been reduced to nothing. His jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together as his mind latched onto one singular, unshakable thought: revenge. Did they really think they could humiliate him and get away with it? Did they really think they could take everything from him without consequences? If they had stripped him of his authority, if they had taken his career, then he would take something from them, something bigger, something they couldn't recover from. His strides lengthened, his heartbeat pounded against his ribs, his mind sharpening into cold determination. If they thought they had won, they were wrong. He wasn't done. This wasn't over. Reynolds finally glanced over, sensing the shift, seeing the rigid tension in Mitchell's posture, the way his fists remained clenched at his sides, his breathing growing more erratic. Something in his expression sent a ripple of unease through Reynolds, but he hesitated before speaking. Mitchell let it go. "It's over," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge the words, didn't even slow his steps. The fire in his chest only burned hotter. Over? This was just the beginning. Mitchell sat in his old car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His darkened eyes remained fixed on the small, modest house tucked away in a quiet residential neighborhood, Samuel Harris's home. A simple place, nothing extravagant, but a place where the old man believed he was safe, where he thought justice and dignity would protect him. Mitchell smirked. He had lost everything: his honor, his career, his authority, and the pride he had built over the years, all because of a stubborn old man and a self-righteous son who wanted to play hero. But Mitchell was not the type to accept defeat. He wanted them to feel everything he had felt. There was no need to act recklessly. The best revenge wasn't impulsive. It was slow, precise, like a blade slicing carefully until the victim bled out without realizing they were dying. Mitchell had begun watching Samuel that very day, not in an obvious way, but from a distance, parking his car across the street, sitting in a nearby cafe, memorizing the old man's routine. He woke up at 6 a.m., took a walk around the neighborhood with his new cane, the one Daniel had bought to replace the one Mitchell had snapped in half. A perfect replacement, perhaps, but it didn't matter. Mitchell wasn't interested in breaking Samuel's cane anymore. He wanted to break his entire life. Samuel often visited a small grocery store nearby, where he chatted with the owner, a middle-aged man named Wallace. They talked like old friends, completely unaware that a pair of eyes was watching them from afar. And then, of course, there was Daniel Harris, the moralistic police chief who thought he could erase Mitchell from existence with a single decision. Did he really believe he could protect his father forever? Mitchell knew the system inside and out. He knew its weaknesses, the cracks in the foundation. He had been part of the force long enough to understand exactly how to make a man like Daniel fall. He started making calls, reaching out to old connections within the department. Not everyone admired Daniel Harris. Some of his fellow officers despised the way he carried himself, always acting like a paragon of justice, refusing to play politics, always putting principle above personal gain. Men like him didn't last long in a system built on self-preservation. Mitchell made his first call to Lieutenant Carter, a man with long-standing resentment toward Daniel. Carter had always felt overshadowed by the so-called honorable police chief, his ambition stifled by Daniel's unwavering sense of morality. A short conversation, a few well-placed suggestions about ways to make Daniel's career a nightmare, and a subtle promise that Mitchell could help Carter climb higher. Mitchell wasn't in a rush. He just needed to plant a seed of doubt, create a ripple of problems, and let it grow into a storm that would consume everything. He would keep Daniel tangled in bureaucratic nightmares, internal investigations, whispers of corruption, political maneuvering that forced him to fight for his own survival. And while Daniel was too busy putting out those fires, Mitchell would focus on Samuel, because nothing was more painful than watching someone you love be destroyed piece by piece. Mitchell took a slow breath, pressed the gas pedal, and drove away from the neighborhood. The game had officially begun. The night draped a heavy darkness over the quiet neighborhood. The dim glow of streetlights reflected off the damp pavement after an earlier drizzle. The entire street was asleep, undisturbed, silent except for the occasional whisper of the wind rustling through the trees. But in the shadows, something was lurking. Mitchell sat in his car a few houses down from Samuel Harris's home, gripping the steering wheel, his gaze locked on the modest house in front of him. He wasn't alone, for masked figures stood hidden behind the trees, dressed in dark clothing, motionless like hunters waiting for the perfect moment. He gave a slight nod, and without hesitation, the four figures moved swiftly across the small yard, silent as ghosts. Inside, Samuel Harris slept soundly, unaware that in just a few moments, his world would be shattered. Crash! The sound of breaking glass tore through the silence. Sharp shards clattered onto the wooden floor, followed by heavy footsteps stomping through the house. The front door flew open with a violent kick, the hinges screeching under the force. Samuel's eyes snapped open, his heartbeat pounded in his chest, but not in fear. This was the reflex of a soldier. He didn't panic. His body, though aged, reacted instinctively to the looming danger. He reached for his cane beside the bed and rushed out of his room. As he stepped into the hallway, the dim light from the living room barely illuminated the shadows moving inside. A figure knocked over a lamp, plunging the room into deeper darkness. Another twirled a knife between his fingers, toying with it like a predator playing with its prey. They didn't speak, but Samuel knew they weren't just here to scare him. Without hesitation, he tightened his grip on his cane and lunged at the nearest figure. He was no longer in his prime, but the strength of a man who had once fought for his country still remained. The cane struck hard into the man's ribs, making him stumble, but before Samuel could land another blow, a fist slammed into his side. He staggered but refused to fall. Another attacker charged from behind, swinging a punch. Samuel turned just in time, but the strike still connected with his shoulder, making him lurch forward. His cane slipped from his grip, clattering onto the floor. Wham! Another punch drove into his stomach. His breath hitched. His vision blurred for a moment, but he ground his teeth and fought to stay upright. Then he heard it, a small, terrified cry from the next room. His daughter. Samuel clenched his jaw, trying to regain his balance, but a heavy boot crashed into his chest, pinning him to the ground. A voice rang out above him. "Well, what now, old man?" Samuel recognized that voice instantly. Mitchell. He wasn't wearing a mask. He didn't need to hide anymore. He crouched down, his eyes burning with hatred as he stared into Samuel's face. "Does this feel the same as when you humiliated me in that diner?" Mitchell sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Do you feel good about it now?" "Because I don't." Samuel didn't reply, his eyes unwavering, meeting Mitchell's with quiet defiance. Mitchell pressed his boot harder into Samuel's back. "This is just the beginning. I'm going to take everything from you, piece by piece." A loud crash erupted as one of the men smashed a glass cabinet, sending shards scattering across the floor. Samuel could hear his daughter sobbing in the other room, but he couldn't reach her. The pain from the beating was suffocating, but the real pain came from knowing he couldn't protect his family. Mitchell leaned in closer, his breath cold against Samuel's ear. "You think Daniel can protect you forever? You think I'll forget this?" Samuel still said nothing. He just held Mitchell's gaze, the gaze of a man who refused to be broken. Outside, a sudden burst of headlights sliced through the darkness. Mitchell stiffened, his head snapping toward the window. A vehicle was speeding toward the house, its beams illuminating the yard. He didn't need to look twice to know who it was. Daniel Harris. Mitchell cursed under his breath. "We'll finish this later," he growled before signaling his men. They vanished into the night just as Daniel's car skidded to a halt outside. Samuel remained on the floor, battered but unshaken. He knew this wasn't over. The battle had only just begun. Daniel Harris barely let the car come to a full stop before throwing the door open and rushing toward the house. The engine was still humming, but he didn't care. His heartbeat pounded violently against his chest as he took in the scene before him. The front door blown open, shattered glass scattered across the floor, and the undeniable evidence of an attack that had just taken place. There was no time to think. He pulled his gun and stormed inside, his eyes scanning every corner of the house. What he saw made his breath hitch. Samuel Harris was on the floor, his shirt disheveled, his breathing heavy, his face bruised. A chair lay overturned, the remnants of a broken glass cabinet littering the ground. In the corner of the room, his daughter was curled up, trembling, her eyes still wide with terror. Daniel rushed to his father's side, kneeling beside him. "Dad, are you okay?" His voice was steady, but the urgency in it was unmistakable. Samuel inhaled deeply, his sharp, unwavering gaze meeting his son's. With effort, he pushed himself up, bracing against the floor, his other hand clutching his side. "They're gone," he muttered, his voice pained but firm. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Who?" Samuel didn't need to answer. Daniel already knew Mitchell. The mere thought of that name ignited a fury deep inside him. Mitchell had refused to stay down. He had lost everything: his badge, his job, but he had still come back, still clung to his resentment, still let his hatred consume him. Daniel stood abruptly, his eyes dark with something lethal. "He really thinks he can get away with this?" Samuel exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "He won't stop, Daniel. He wants to break you. He wants you to lose control. Don't let him win." Daniel clenched his fists. He took a long, steady breath, forcing himself to push past the anger boiling inside him. But this time, he wouldn't just respond. He would strike first. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "I need a tactical team at my father's house immediately. This is an emergency." Within minutes, police vehicles swarmed the quiet neighborhood. Red and blue lights flashed in the night, illuminating the house as heavily armed officers filed out of their cars, securing the perimeter. Some moved inside to check on Samuel and his daughter, while Daniel remained outside, his expression set like stone. "Mitchell has gone too far," he said to Lieutenant Carter, who had just stepped out of a patrol car. "This wasn't just an attack on an old man. This was an attack on my father in his own home. And this time, I'm making sure he doesn't walk away." Carter's face was tight with concern. "We've been tracking Mitchell's movements after his suspension. He started associating with a small-time criminal crew in the city. I think he's getting help from them." Daniel's jaw flexed, his teeth grinding. "Then tonight, we end this. He stepped toward a nearby patrol car, grabbing the radio. "All units, be advised. We have an active manhunt. Target, Mitchell. He is armed, dangerous, and must be taken down before sunrise." The radio crackled with responses as multiple units acknowledged the order. Police teams mobilized, dispersing across the city, launching a full-scale pursuit. Daniel stared into the darkness ahead. Mitchell could run, but this time, there would be no escape. Rain drizzled over the empty streets, the dull glow of streetlights reflecting off the slick pavement. In an alleyway behind an abandoned industrial complex, shadows loomed thick, broken only by the faint flicker of distant warehouse windows. Mitchell stood there, his back pressed against a damp brick wall, his breath ragged, his bloodshot eyes locked on the darkness before him. His coat was drenched, the cold seeping into his skin, but his grip on the old pistol in his hand remained firm. He knew this was the end of the line, but at this point, he didn't care. He had nothing left to lose. Footsteps echoed through the alley. Mitchell didn't need to look up to know who it was. Daniel Harris stepped forward from the shadows, his footsteps steady, his presence unwavering. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't rush. This wasn't a chase anymore. This was the end. Mitchell let out a bitter chuckle, but it was hollow, stripped of the arrogance it once held. "So, you finally found me, huh, Chief? Guess I couldn't run forever." Daniel stopped a few feet away, his eyes locked onto the man who had once been his colleague. "You think this is a game, Mitchell? You went too far." Mitchell scoffed, shaking his head. "Too far? I did what I had to do. I lost everything because of your old man and your self-righteous morals. I was just trying to take back what was mine." Daniel's expression hardened. "Justice? You call breaking into a man's home and beating him half to death justice? You think what you did would ever restore your dignity?" Mitchell's jaw tightened, his eyes blazing with fury. "Dignity?" His voice cracked as he let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Do you even know what dignity is, Daniel? Dignity was when I dedicated my life to the force, and they threw me out like garbage over one damn incident. I had power, I had respect, and now, because of you and your father, I'm nothing. I lost everything." Daniel inhaled deeply, his voice calm but cutting. "You didn't lose everything because of my father. You lost everything because of yourself. You destroyed your own life, Mitchell. You always thought you had the right to judge people, but you never once looked in the mirror." Mitchell's hands trembled, the gun shaking slightly. "You think I need a damn lecture from you? I'm past that, Daniel. There's no way out for me anymore." Daniel studied him for a long moment before speaking slowly. "There's always a choice, Mitchell. You just never take the right one." Mitchell's grip on the gun tightened, but his hands shook. The rain kept falling, the silence between them stretching long enough for reality to set in. In the distance, the wail of police sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flickered against the alley walls. The perimeter was sealed. There was nowhere to run. Daniel took another step forward, his voice low but firm. "Drop the gun, Mitchell. Don't turn this into something worse than it already is." Mitchell stared at him, his breathing uneven. In that moment, flashes of his past raced through his mind. His early years in the force, his patrols, his laughter with colleagues, his slow descent into bitterness, the moment he lost everything. And then he finally understood. It had been over for a long time. His eyes stung as he exhaled, his body suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. A drop of rain trailed down his face, mixing with something warm. Slowly, he let go. The gun slipped from his grasp, clattering against the wet pavement. Daniel held his gaze for a long moment before motioning to the officers behind him. Mitchell didn't resist as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He only bowed his head because he knew this was the end. Mitchell was pushed into the back of the patrol car, his hands cuffed behind him. He didn't resist. He didn't yell or struggle. He knew it was over. The police convoy pulled away from the alley, sirens wailing through the empty streets, red and blue lights flashing against the wet pavement. Rain streaked the car window, distorting his reflection, a face that no longer held defiance, only emptiness. At the station, he was taken straight to the interrogation room. Across from him, Daniel Harris sat still, his eyes locked onto the man who had once been his colleague. This time, there was no anger, only disappointment. Mitchell didn't speak. He stared at the table, his jaw clenched, but there was no fight left in him. The evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints at the crime scene, surveillance footage, witness testimonies. There was no escape. A few weeks later, the trial concluded swiftly. Mitchell was sentenced to 25 years in prison, convicted of assault, home invasion, aggravated battery, and intent to cause bodily harm. As the judge read out the sentence, he didn't react. He didn't beg, didn't plead. He had already lost everything long before he stepped into the courtroom. No badge, no allies, no power, no freedom. As he was led away, he turned his head slightly, his eyes landing on Samuel Harris sitting next to Daniel. The old man still bore the bruises from the attack, but his expression remained strong, unwavering. Mitchell wanted to say something, to sneer, to lash out one last time, but nothing came. There was nothing left to say. He had lost. Samuel Harris finally returned to his life, though things would never be the same. His bruises faded, but the deeper scars, the humiliation, the fear of being attacked in his own home, would take longer to heal. Yet through it all, he realized one thing. He was not alone. The community rallied behind him. Neighbors visited, checking in on him. The local grocery store sent food. Veterans from the area came by, shaking his hand, offering their respect. The diner where it all started changed too. It was no longer a place of silence, of people looking away. The fear of speaking up had been broken. One morning, as Samuel stepped onto his porch, he found a new walking cane waiting for him. A small note was attached to the handle. "Thank you for never backing down." He smiled. Daniel stood beside him, watching with quiet pride. After everything, after the fear, the pain, the fight, they had made it through. The past couldn't be changed, but one thing was certain. Justice had been served, and Samuel Harris had reclaimed his peace. Justice has been served. Mitchell has paid the price for his actions. Samuel Harris has regained his peace, and the community around him has changed, no longer remaining silent in the face of injustice. But this story is more than just an isolated incident. It serves as a reminder that arrogance, hatred, and abuse of power can lead to devastating consequences. It is also a testament to the strength of resilience, courage, and justice. Now, what about you? What do you think about the punishment given to Mitchell? Do you believe 25 years in prison is a fair sentence for what he did, or should he have received an even harsher punishment? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. What would you do if you witnessed a similar situation? Would you stand up for justice? And don't forget to hit subscribe to stay updated with more powerful stories like this. Let's continue to spread the message of justice, compassion, and change together.